LiberalViewer presents.
So, welcome to the October 20th edition of LiberalViewer Sunday Live Clip Roundup. Thanks for joining me. Give me a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel if you like what I'm doing here every Sunday for the last 338 Sundays. Tonight, I've picked out the weekend's 13 best, most newsworthy clips for what should be a really educational, fair use, media criticism, and political commentary show for you all tonight. Down in the video description, you can follow along on my clip list. I put a link to the clip list with my own notes where you can follow along and see what my 13 clips are about. Impeachment is, again, the main topic for the program tonight. And this week, it basically looks virtually certain that Trump will be impeached by the House this year. That doesn't mean removed by the Senate, but if you look at your Constitution, you know it just takes a majority of the House to impeach. There was an additional revelation this week from Trump's acting Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney that there actually was a quid pro quo between military aid to the Ukraine and investigating Democrats, this whole Crowdstrike server conspiracy theory. And Mick Mulvaney will be in the news clips and tonight's political comedy, which will be the last couple minutes of Bill Maher's monologue, making some quid pro quo jokes that I'll get to in a moment. But I also want to make sure you stay tuned for the second topic, which will be the 2020 Democratic candidate, presidential candidate update. I'll have two Pete Buttigieg clips and an Amy Klobuchar clip, following up on the healthcare debate in the Democratic candidate debate last Tuesday that unfortunately I didn't get a chance to cover, but I'll discuss when I get to that second topic, so stay tuned for that. Also briefly discuss the crisis for the Syrian Kurds that Donald Trump pretended to solve this week because it was covered by all the corporate news media, though I'll mainly cover it as a symptom of the erosion of support for Trump among congressional Republicans. But the big topic again is Trump's quid pro quo and the revelation from Trump's acting chief of staff that there actually was a quid pro quo between military aid to the Ukraine and investigating Democrats, which he tried to pretend, Mick Mulvaney tried to pretend he didn't say on Fox News Sunday this morning and then got skewered by Fox News Sunday host Chris Wallace, and I'll show that whole 6-minute clip in all of its glory and discuss it with you, along with the reasons that this is very important about the whole quid pro quo issue. Not all quid pro quos are bad, and not all bad things require a quid pro quo. So in some ways, the quid pro quo issue isn't the real issue, but that is the real issue that was the topic, the main topic of the Sunday morning news analysis shows that I'm going to focus on. And as promised, I'm going to start with political comedy, the quid pro quo jokes about Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney's big gaffe this week from Bill Maher's monologue. In the first clip, I will show you over here.
And then Mick Mulvaney, the guy I mentioned before, not have a good week. He's not quitting, not yet. But he is the acting chief of staff. You know this. He's got a other big job. He's the head of the Office of Management and Budget. Running the White House is his side hustle. So the whole defense of the Ukrainian scandal, which is why Trump is getting impeached, is there was no quid pro quo. No quid pro quo is the new no collusion. Mulvaney gets up there yesterday and says, oh, fuck yeah, quid pro quo. Oh, yeah, we are total quid pro quo people. That's all we do all day is quid pro quo, quid pro quo. And then he says, but it was absolutely appropriate. So appropriate, he had to go out there hours later and say, I'm sorry. You thought I said quid pro quo, that it was okay to do quid pro quo? No, I said tic-tac-toe. Tic-tac-toe is okay. I said, it was a... Taekwondo is fine. They're the gang that couldn't do treason straight. All right, we got a great show. We have
So yeah, the gang that couldn't do treason straight. I like that joke. There were actually a couple other good jokes in the monologue. For some reason, on the HBO Real-Time channel on YouTube, they didn't upload the monologue this week, so I guess that's the only free part of it you can get that, like I said, I thought those were a good joke. I mean, they were mostly like puns on quid pro quo. which, I mean, that's not the most intellectually deep joke, but like I said, I thought the gang that couldn't treason straight was good, and there were a couple other jokes that he made earlier in the monologue. Maybe they'll upload it, and if so, I'll add a link to it later, but as of when I did this broadcast, no Bill Maher monologue for free on YouTube this week. But the thing about the quid pro quo that I wanted to talk about, first of all, countries in foreign policy do quid pro quos all the time. Like if the United States and Russia, they agree, we will destroy half our nuclear weapons if you destroy half your nuclear weapons. That's a quid pro quo. That's foreign policy. That is the kind of thing that countries do all the time. So not all foreign policy quid pro quos are bad. It just means that countries are making deals based on their national interests. On the other hand, just asking a foreign national to give something of value to your political campaign, just asking, is a crime. I want to show you down in the video description. I put a link to, for many, many weeks to this is 52 U.S. Code section 30121, contributions and donations by foreign nationals. And if you look at subsection A sub 2, it says it shall be unlawful for a person to solicit, accept, or receive a contribution or donation described in subparagraph A or B from a foreign national. And it doesn't have to be like a foreign government. It can be any foreign national who's not a permanent resident of the United States. And if you look at a contribution or donation of money, or this is subsection 1A, a contribution or donation of money or other thing of value, or to make an express or implied promise to make a contribution or donation. And if you remember back in the Mueller report, the whole Trump Tower meeting where Donald Trump Jr. was trying to get dirt on Hillary Clinton, said that would be great, and he set up the meeting. That kind of was a solicitation of dirt on a political opponent for a federal campaign. But if you read the Mueller report, he said, well, maybe Don Jr., because it has a very high intent requirement, you basically have to know that it's illegal for it to be a crime and not just a non-criminal violation that just requires a fine. So Mueller said, well, Don Jr. might not be smart enough to know what he was doing was a crime. But, that only works so far. I mean, we're all on notice now from the Mueller report, and Donald Trump is on notice that asking for aid from a foreigner in your federal campaign, that is a crime, as you see right here in 52 U.S. Code section 30121, there's a link to that down in the video description. You can read the federal law yourself. Now, so that doesn't require a quid pro quo. And in fact, in some ways, a quid pro quo is a defense to that law, because some people bring up how the Clinton campaign paid for the Steele dossier, and he's a foreigner, and he paid Russians to dig up dirt on Trump, but they paid for that. That's not a contribution or donation. That's like, if I buy $1,000 worth of campaign buttons from a Russian and I pay $1,000 for them, that's not a contribution or donation. That's fine. But if a Russian gives me $1,000 worth of campaign buttons as a donation, that violates the federal law that I've been pointing to. So I just wanted to point out, now some crimes do require quid pro quo. One of those is bribery or extortion. And some people say that that's what Trump was doing to the Ukraine, and that's an important thing. Bribery is actually one of the named reasons for impeachment. If you look at your Constitution, it's bribery, treason, and other high crimes and misdemeanors, if I'm getting that correct. I'm doing that from memory, but I will look at that while I show you the news summary, the first of the news summaries from NBC News' Meet the Press. This is Chuck Todd doing the usual good job of, and certainly the longest job of summarizing the news. There's some Syrian news in here. This is basically testing the limits of his presidency. Trump is testing the limits of his presidency this week, I'm looking at my notes here. This is clip number 2, both with the whole Syria debacle, with the claiming he was going to hold the G7 summit at his own resort in Doral, the Doral resort in Miami, and then he changed his mind overnight. That's covered in this clip, and shows his approval is still high with Republicans. And then there's a whole package about all the stuff that happened this week on impeachment that I will talk about with you after we watch that clip together over here.
Good Sunday morning. This week we saw President Trump test the limits of his presidency, gambling on how much the public, his party, and the world can accept. At home, Mr. Trump tested the limits of how much the public is willing to believe. Shortly after his chief of staff, Mick Mulvaney, said, yes, of course the president held back aid to Ukraine as part of a quid pro quo. Mulvaney had to revise and extend his remarks, saying there was absolutely no quid pro quo. On Capitol Hill, Mr. Trump tested the limits of what his party will accept. A majority of House Republicans joined Democrats to overwhelmingly condemn the president's abandonment of the Kurds. Then, after Vice President Pence announced a deal universally seen as a total capitulation to Turkey, the president called it a great day for civilization. And overseas, Mr. Trump tested the world's faith in relying on America. As retired Admiral William McRaven wrote in an op-ed essay that was fairly powerful, if our promises are meaningless, how will our allies ever trust us? In fact, in a sign of Mr. Trump's weakening position, apparently there are limits. Last night, he gave in to critics and reversed his decision to hold next year's G7 summit at his Florida Doral resort. But despite cracks in his support in Washington, President Trump's approval rating remains resilient among Republicans so far, as it has throughout other crises in his presidency. And his base is showing no sign that its patience is being tested yet.
I took a lot of heat, even from some of our congressmen, even from some of our senators, but now they're all happy.
But that's not true. After a week of damaging impeachment depositions in Congress, a much criticized so-called ceasefire in Syria, and the admission of a quid pro quo in Ukraine, the president's Republican support in Congress is showing signs of erosion. On Monday, the president's former top advisor on Russia testified that former National Security Advisor John Bolton called Rudy Giuliani a hand grenade who's going to blow everybody up. Bolton describing Giuliani's work in Ukraine as a drug deal. On Wednesday, the House voted 354 to 60 to condemn the president's Syria policy, a stinging bipartisan rebuke.
We ceded, effectively, Syria over to Russia and Turkey.
That afternoon, the president exploded in a closed-door White House meeting with Democrats after comments from Speaker Nancy Pelosi.
I have concerns about all roads leading to Putin. That seemed to have angered the president.
On Thursday, the president's acting chief of staff, Mick Mulvaney, admitted what the president has long denied.
There was no quid pro quo. No quid pro quo. No quid pro quo.
But Mulvaney said President Trump did hold up military aid to Ukraine to pressure its president to assist in a Justice Department investigation into the 2016 election.
You just described as a quid pro quo.
We do that all the time with foreign policy.
Just hours after confirming the quid pro quo, Mulvaney walked that back. In a statement, there was absolutely no quid pro quo between Ukrainian military aid and any investigation into the 2016 election. Some Republicans have defended the president.
Mick Mulvaney clarified his statement to be very clear.
But increasingly, there is skepticism and now criticism.
You don't hold up foreign aid that we had previously appropriated for a political initiative.
And the so-called Syria ceasefire Vice President Pence announced that afternoon gave Turkey what it wanted at no cost.
What we have done to the Kurds will stand as a blood stain in the annals of American history.
Senator Lindsey Graham warns of ethnic cleansing, and Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell calls the president's policy a grave strategic mistake. While the majority of Republicans continue to oppose impeachment, cracks are beginning to appear.
Does this rise to the level of impeachment? I now believe that it does.
I'm very mindful of the fact that back during Watergate, everybody said, oh, it's a witch hunt to get Nixon. Turns out it wasn't a witch hunt. It was absolutely correct.
And joining me now is a former Republican, now independent member of...
And that's actually an interview with Justin Amash that I don't have a clip from Justin Amash, although I do have several actual Republicans. Justin Amash left the Republican Party. But I actually have 4 different Republicans I'm showing you. First, Mick Mulvaney trying to claim he didn't say what he said about the quid pro quo. And then Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. then two members of the Congress who are of the House of Representatives who are leaving, who you would think might say something slightly anti-Trump, and one of them is Will Hurd from Texas, and then Francis Rooney from, is he from Nevada? I think he might be from Nevada. I'm not positive about that. But I'll have those four Republicans responding to this whole quid pro quo issue. But I want to show you four more news summaries that, like I said, I thought the Meet the Press news summary was pretty good. It was definitely the longest and most extensive. By the way, while we were watching that, I did look in my ACLU Constitution. If you have the ACLU Constitution, look on page 17. This is Section 4 of Article 2, the last part right before Article 3 starts. It says, the President, Vice President, and all civil officers of the United States shall be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. So bribery is a crime that requires a quid pro quo. And extortion, which might fit a little bit, is kind of like bribery. It's like bribery is you give something good to get something. Extortion is you threaten something bad to get something. So they're kind of like the same crime in like one is sort of like the reverse of, you know, the reverse incentive, but still the same crime. And so I think that may be why the quid pro quo is important in an impeachment sense, because it fits into the bribery extortion rubric, which is specifically mentioned in Article 2, Section 4 of the Constitution as a reason. But just, you know, the federal campaign finance law, asking a foreigner for help in a federal election. We saw Trump do that on the South Lawn in clips I showed in previous Sunday Clips Roundup. You know, first he did it when he was a candidate, Russia, if you're listening, and then he said, yes, I want Ukraine to investigate the Bidens, and China too. China, if you're listening, investigate the Bidens. That's, again, a violation of federal law, just to solicit a foreigner, not even a foreign government, just a foreigner for something of value in a federal election. Actually, if you read that carefully, it says, actually, it's in a federal, state, or local election. So it's not just federal election, but in this case, it is a federal election. Anyway, so I want to move on to the shorter but still very good news summary from ABC's This Week with George Stephanopoulos, which covers all the stuff. And then also, you'll see at the very end, there's an interview with a Syrian Kurdish leader. Basically, none of us really believed Trump and Pence and Pompeo when they said, Trump had this news conference, everybody's happy, the Kurds are happy, everybody's happy, maybe ISIS isn't so happy, but the Kurds aren't happy about this whole deal where they have to move out of this huge territory where they've been living, and they're basically becoming refugees and moving to Iraq, and Turkey's basically cleansing all Kurds from this Kurdish area of Syria, and that is included as a special extra part of this ABC News This Week with George Stephanopoulos news summary from this morning over here.
Good morning and welcome to This Week. We come on the air this morning after a rare late-night retreat from President Trump. Bowing to fierce criticism and the prospect of a new front in the fight over impeachment, Trump fired off a tweet shortly before 10 p.m., announcing the next year's G7 summit would not be held at his Miami hotel after all. The original announcement made Thursday at that stunning press conference where Acting Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney admitted what the president had been denying for weeks, that military aid to Ukraine was conditioned on that country pursuing a political investigation for President Trump.
But to be clear, what you just described is a quid pro quo. It is funding will not flow unless the investigation into the Democratic server happens as well.
We do that all the time with foreign policy. And I have news for everybody. Get over it.
All this as Turkey continued to pound the Kurdish people who fought side by side with America against ISIS. Attacks enabled by President Trump's precipitous decision to pull American forces out of Syria. That move has drawn harsh condemnation from even the president's closest allies in Congress, the senators he'll need to defend him if and when an impeachment trial comes. In Dallas Thursday night, Trump dismissed those concerns.
And it was unconventional what I did. I said, they're going to have to fight a little while. Sometimes you have to let them fight a little while. It's like two kids in a lot. You got to let them fight, and then you pull them apart.
A pause in the fighting negotiated by Vice President Mike Pence and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. It's in a tenuous state this morning. Our foreign correspondent James Longman spoke to a Kurdish commander who contradicted Trump's claim that the Kurds are happy with his decision.
I would like to tell Mr. Trump the Kurds are not happy. For us, the American troop withdrawal was like a knife in the back of the Kurdish people. The agreement will not stop the genocide of the Kurdish people. I would like to say to Mr. Trump, you must solve this with Turkey.
And we are joined now by the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo. Thank you for joining us.
And like I said, I will have a Mike Pompeo clip coming up, from George Stephanopoulos' interview where he can't really deal with the whole quid pro quo issue and what Mick Mulvaney said. But like I said, I thought what was extra special about the ABC news summary was that they had that Kurdish commander at the end contradicting. I mean, not like anything that comes out of Trump's mouth is believable, or if he told me the sky was blue, I'd have to look out the window before I believed it. Or actually, it's getting kind of dark out there. It's not really blue right now, but by the way, did you watch my show last week where I was on the road and I did it in front of this window where it got like darker and darker and darker? I went back and watched. I didn't like listen. I sort of like sped through it just to look at the background, and I thought that was really cool how I did it at sunset, and it started off with like the sun in my face and ended with like black behind me. I thought that was like a cool effect. But as you can see, I'm back in my studio. I'm still wearing my Impeach Trump t-shirt. I'm hoping this is the week that I may actually get the ones printed up that I can offer to you for donations to support my channel. And I've had a lot of aspirations to do stuff regarding my YouTube channel that I haven't been able to do in the last few weeks because other things have come up. You saw I was out of town last week, and some ACLU stuff has come up and some family stuff, and so I think this is going to be the week that I will actually get some idea of the Impeach Trump shirts, and I won't have to wear this shirt every week over and over again. Maybe I can go back to some of my nice button silk shirts that I wear most weeks. But anyway, I don't know how I got into that digression, but I said the good thing about that last clip was the Kurdish commander who got to say that she was fact-checking Trump and what he said was not true. You hear a lot of the same facts about the Doral retreat and the Syria situation and the quid pro quo in this even shorter CNN State of the Union news summary where we're all experiencing whiplash. That's the State of the Union this week. And what's extra special about this news summary at the end is what Jake Tapper tells us about the way the White House is not coming on the show for weeks on end. Top Republicans will not come on the show and explain the wrongdoing of the Trump administration that I will discuss with you a little more after we watch Jake Tapper's introduction to CNN's State of the Union this morning over here.
Hello, I'm Jake Tapper in Washington, where the State of our Union is experiencing whiplash. President Trump is making a rare retreat this weekend after an absolute pileup of scandals, admissions, and miscalculations that seemed to shock even his staunchest allies. Late Saturday night, the president canceled his plan to host the G7 summit at his own Doral resort in Florida, reversing himself after harsh criticism from both sides of the aisle that he was steering government money to his own pockets. In fact, for a president who needs the support of congressional Republicans to keep his job, President Trump seemed to be testing the limits this week. At least one Republican lawmaker didn't rule out backing impeachment after the White House acting chief of staff admitted out loud Thursday that there was, in fact, a quid pro quo involving U.S. aid to Ukraine, a confession followed by yet another attempted walkback. And amid violence in Syria, the top Senate Republican declared the president's withdrawal a, quote, strategic nightmare, while the president touted a temporary ceasefire that many viewed as a complete and utter capitulation to Turkey. For the fourth week in a row, the White House and top House and Senate Republicans have refused to come on this newscast to answer our questions about all of these important developments. The invitation remains open. We hope they will come to explain all of this to the American people because, especially at a time when the White House has ended the practice of regular press briefings, they are shirking this important part of their duty to the American public to explain what they are doing with our money and in our name. Joining me now, 2020 presidential candidate and
as I said, I will have a couple of Pete Buttigieg clips and an Amy Klobuchar clip when I get to the 2020 Democratic presidential candidate update as the second topic at the end here. But before I get to that, I have two more news summaries and 4 Republicans to go over this whole quid pro quo issue. The next news summary is actually from CBS's Face the Nation, and then comes Fox News Sunday. CBS Face the Nation sometimes seems like it's Fox News Light, like it's sometimes the most conservative of the 5 corporate outlets other than Fox News. And they usually don't do a news summary, and so I'm surprised this week that Margaret Brennan and CBS News' Face the Nation did it's almost 3.5-minute news summary. You'll see there's a bunch of stuff on Syria, and they actually go into more detail about what's been happening in the depositions, the impeachment depositions that haven't been public, so all we know about is like leak stuff. And I didn't want to cover that too much because I'm hoping to cover the public hearings that come later. And I talked about the way you last week on my Sunday live clip roundup when Adam Schiff talked about why you depose witnesses in secret so they can't coordinate their statements. And then later you have public hearings where you can nail them down on what they already said under oath in the depositions, and how that matches with what I used to do as a criminal defense attorney in Missouri, not in California, where you don't get to depose witnesses before trial as a criminal defense attorney, but in Missouri you did, and that was a great tool to lock witnesses down to their testimony, and then you can use that deposition testimony as a leash to make them say what you want to say. And so I talked about that a lot last week, and a lot of those depositions went on this week. We don't know exactly what happened in there because it's secret, but some of that was covered, and more of it was covered on CBS News' Face the Nation in their news summary than any of the other news summaries. So that's the extra special thing CBS did this week, which I will talk about with you after we watch that clip together over here.
Good morning and welcome to Face the Nation. It was another chaotic week as we bounced between breaking news on the fighting in Syria and Democrats' impeachment investigation in Washington. Chaos in Syria. As adversaries advanced faster than the U.S. could retreat, American troops took the extraordinary action of bombing their own base to keep supplies out of enemy hands. Vice President Pence led an emergency mission to ask Turkey to pause its invasion.
Turkey and the United States of America have agreed to a ceasefire in Syria.
Turkey agreed to a 5-day pause in exchange for a U.S. promise to lift sanctions. President Erdogan won another key concession. America's Kurdish allies must flee northern Syria.
Without spilling a drop of American blood, not one drop of American blood. Sometimes you have to let them fight. It's like 2 kids in a lot. You got to let them fight, and then you pull them apart.
A Wednesday White House meeting on Syria brought Democratic leaders face to face with President Trump for the first time since the impeachment probe began. It didn't go smoothly. Democrats walked out, claiming the president insulted the speaker.
We were offended deeply by his treatment of the Speaker of the House of Representatives.
Go ahead, what we witnessed on the part of the president was a meltdown. Sad to say.
Earlier that day, Republicans and Democrats had overwhelmingly voted to rebuke the president for his decision to withdraw troops. In a rare move, some Senate Republicans also spoke out.
Many of us have been arguing that this was a mistake, It shouldn't have been done.
What we have done to the Kurds will stand as a blood stain in the annals of American history.
Meanwhile, the impeachment inquiry intensified. Fiona Hill, a former National Security Council official, told investigators that she had notified White House lawyers in July after she had heard Gordon Sondland, ambassador to the EU, offer Ukrainian officials a meeting between their president and Mr. Trump if an investigation was opened into Burisma, a Ukrainian energy company that Joe Biden's son Hunter worked for. John Bolton, the president's national security advisor, likened it to a drug deal and said he wanted no part of it. But Ambassador Sondland testified that no one ever raised any concerns and said that it was the president who had directed him to work with personal lawyer Rudy Giuliani on the project. The president's chief of staff was also implicated and on Thursday appeared to admit to reporters that he held up military aid for Ukraine in part because President Trump wanted the country to investigate a conspiracy theory about Democrats in the 2016 election.
The corruption related to the DNC server? Absolutely. No question about that. But that's it. And that's why we held up the money. Now, there was a report.
So the demand for an investigation into the Democrats was part of the reason that he was ordered to withhold funding to Ukraine.
The look back to what happened in 2016 certainly was part of the thing that he was worried about in corruption with that nation. And that is absolutely appropriate.
The funding.
Yeah, which ultimately then flowed.
Later in the day, Mulvaney released a statement trying to walk back what he had just said. We begin this morning with a top Democrat on the House Intelligence Committee.
I actually don't have a Jim Himes clip. That was Jim Himes, one of the top Democrats on the Intelligence Committee. But I do have a clip later of Margaret Brennan talking to Will Hurd, a Republican from Texas who's retiring at the end of this term that, ends in 2020, or actually in January 2021. But I think it's good to see CBS News' Face the Nation do any kind of news summary. They don't normally do a news summary, and they spend a lot of time talking about the testimony that's been going on behind closed doors on Capitol Hill or in the House Intelligence Committee. So that was useful information, and I thought that was a worthwhile news summary. And actually, the Fox News Sunday news summary is pretty much straight news and is covering all the same stuff you just saw from the other news summaries, which is remarkable in and of itself for Fox News. And I said last week after Shepard Smith was or left the network that there were very few oases of truth, and sometimes Chris Wallace on Fox News Sunday can be one of these oases of truth on Fox News Sunday. And I think even Kevin Corke was leaning towards the straight news side in this report. And there's a clip in here you I don't think was in any of the other four news summaries of Mark Esper, or he's the Secretary of Defense, who, if you were watching Donald Trump's tweets earlier this morning, I believe he called him Secretary of Defense Esperanto, even though his name is Mark Esper. And there's a clip of him in here contradicting. They don't really emphasize it in the Fox News summary, which at least I guess that's a small criticism. But Mark Esper is saying those troops that we're taking out of Syria, we're not bringing the troops home like Trump said. They're actually moving from Syria to Iraq to try to do the same mission, just from farther away after the Kurds have been ethnically cleansed from northern Syria, just below Turkey there. And I'll talk about that a little more after we watch that Fox News Sunday news summary together over here.
And hello again from Fox News in Washington. We begin with breaking news. President Trump announced by tweet last night he's backing off his controversial decision to hold the G7 summit next year at his own resort. He says the search will now begin for a new site. But the president is still under fire, even from a growing number of Republicans. GOP congressmen voted by more than 2-1 against his policy in Syria. White House Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney said the president had a political quid pro quo for U.S. aid to Ukraine. Mulvaney later denied he said it. and more damaging testimony in the House impeachment investigation. In a moment, we'll talk with the president's chief of staff, who just flinched when I said that. But first, let's bring in Kevin Corke with the latest from the White House. Kevin.
Chris, a precarious pause perhaps best describes the tenuous nature of the circumstance on the ground in Syria as sporadic skirmishes continue to speckle the region, even as we learn much more now about the U.S. strategy for American forces there.
Current game plan is for those forces to reposition into western Iraq. The ones coming out, right? That original 1,000, and then to two missions. One is to help defend Iraq, and two is to perform a counter-ISIS mission.
Back in Washington, the impeachment drumbeat reached a fevered pitch as House Intelligence Committee Chair Adam Schiff interviewed a cascade of Trump administration officials about Ukraine and a possible quid pro quo tying U.S. aid to cooperation with a probe into the Biden's business dealings. Incredibly, the gulf between House Democrats and the White House seemed to grow when Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, stormed out of a White House meeting, accusing the president of having a meltdown over a bipartisan House vote rebuking his pullout in Syria. All as the president late Saturday rescinded his decision to host next year's G7 summit at his resort in Miami, tweeting, "Based on both media and Democrat-crazed and irrational hostility, we will no longer consider Trump National Doral Miami," a reversal that came after withering criticism and accusations of self-dealing.
Can you at least understand and acknowledge that just the appearance of impropriety makes this wince-inducing, and maybe this is something that you want to reconsider?
He got over that a long time ago. We absolutely believe this is the best place to have it. We're going to have it there.
That was then. This is now. By the way, in that tweet, Chris, the president mentioned Camp David as a possible location for next year's G7 summit. It last hosted the G8 back in 2012. Chris?
Kevin Corke reporting from the White House. Kevin, thanks for that. Joining us now for an exclusive interview, White House Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney. Mick, welcome back to Fox News Sunday.
Good morning. Yeah, I flinched a little bit because that's what people are saying that I said, but I didn't say that. But I'm looking forward to the conversation.
He flinched a little bit watching the news summary. By the way, I point this out every now and then during my live clip roundups. One of the reasons I show the news summaries, even though I don't have as good a fair use argument for showing the news summary product of a network as I do for a newsmaker. I have a better fair use argument to use the newsmaker interview clips and then comment on those rather than the news summary product. But the thing is, the corporate news media, when they show those news summaries, their guests are watching them, and often their answers are colored by what they watched. And you saw right there Mick Mulvaney reacting to the news summary, flinching at the news summary for saying what he didn't say, but of course he did say it. And that's the next clip I actually want to show you. Right where I just left off there is Chris Wallace doing an expert cross-examination of Mick Mulvaney, trying to claim he didn't say what he said. And my favorite part of this whole thing, it almost reminds me of this Star Trek Next Generation episode. I think it's the title is A Chain of Command, where Captain Picard is taken captive by a Cardassian who tortures him and tries to get him to say, like, the five lights, or the four lights. There are four lights, but he tries to get him to say there are five lights. Well, this is whether there are 2 reasons or 3 reasons that Trump held back the military aid to the Ukraine. And I watched Mick Mulvaney's press conference that was about the whole, it was actually supposed to be about holding the G7 summit at the Doral Resort in Miami, which that whole reason no longer exists. But then he made this whole quid pro quo gaffe. And he said there were 3 reasons, and one of the 3 reasons was that they held back the aid was waiting for this investigation of the whole Crowdstrike conspiracy theory having to do with the Democratic server. The Ukraine was really responsible for the foreign meddling in the 2016 election, not Russia. It was Ukraine, and you saw the former White House Homeland Security advisor, what's his name? Thomas, I'm blanking on his last name. But I had a clip of him a few weeks back saying that was a debunked conspiracy theory. And I'll look up his name while we're watching this clip here. This is a little over 6 minutes long. Like I said, Chris Wallace expertly showing that Mick Mulvaney said what he actually said, that there was a quid pro quo, that there were 3 reasons, not 3 lights, not 2 lights, 3 reasons, not 2 reasons for holding back the aid. And I'll talk about that a little more after we watch that 6-minute, 16-second clip of Chris Wallace doing a good job as a journalist, cross-examining the White House person who wouldn't go on CNN. Remember, you saw Jake Tapper say, no one from the White House will come on my show. Well, they came on Fox News Sunday, and Mick Mulvaney, I don't know, he's acting chief of staff. By the time you're watching this, does he still have a job? It seems like he's not doing a good job, and Trump might be about to get rid of him. You can let me know what you think after we watch this clip together over here.
Welcome back to Fox News Sunday.
Good morning. Yeah, I flinched a little bit because that's what people are saying that I said, but I didn't say that. But I'm looking forward to the conversation.
All right, let's have the conversation. Yeah. Why? Here's my first question. Why did you say in that briefing that President Trump had ordered a quid pro quo that investigating the Democrats, that aid to Ukraine depended on investigating the Democrats? Why'd you say that?
Again, that's not what I said. That's what people said. That I said, here's what I said. I'll say it again, and hopefully people will listen this time. There were 2 reasons that we held up the aid. We've talked about this at some length. The first one was the rampant corruption in Ukraine. Ukraine, by the way, Chris, is so bad in Ukraine that in 2014 Congress passed a law requiring us to make sure that corruption was moving in the right direction. So corruption's a big deal. Everybody knows it. The president was also concerned about whether or not other nations, specifically European nations, were helping with foreign aid to the Ukraine as well. We've talked about that for quite a while now. I did then mention that in the past, the president had mentioned for me to time about the DNC server. He'd mentioned the DNC server to other people publicly. He even mentioned it to President Zelensky in the phone call, but it wasn't connected to the aid, and that's where I think people got sidetracked this weekend at that press conference. 2 reasons for holding back the aid.
Let me pursue that, though.
Sure.
Because I believe that anyone listening to what you said in that briefing could come to only one conclusion. Let's play what you said.
Sure.
Did he also mention to me in the past the corruption related to the DNC server? Absolutely. No question about that. But that's it. And that's why we held up the money.
You just described is a quid pro quo. It is funding will not flow unless the investigation into the Democratic server happens as well.
We do that all the time with foreign policy.
You were asked specifically by Jonathan Karl, was investigating Democrats one of the conditions for holding up the aid? Was that part of the quid pro quo? And you said it happens all the time.
Yeah, but go back and watch what I said before that. I don't know if you guys can cue it up or not. There was a long answer about corruption and a long answer about
totally said that.
Just like I told you then, and then I said the exact same thing I just said now, which is that he mentioned in passing, yes. But the reason that we held back the aid were the 2 reasons I mentioned, and I can prove it to you. The aid flowed. Once we were able to satisfy ourselves that corruption was actually, they were doing better with it. We got that information from our folks, from the conversation with Mr. Zelensky. And once we were able to establish, we had the Office of Management Budget do research on other countries' aid to Ukraine. It turns out they don't give hardly any lethal aid, but they do give a considerable sum of money in non-lethal aid. Once those 2 things were cleared, the money flowed. There was never any connection between the flow of money and the server.
But Mick, you know, I hate to go through this, but you said what you said. And the fact is, after that exchange with Jonathan Karl, you were asked another time why the aid was held up. What was the condition for the aid? And you didn't mention 2 conditions. You mentioned 3 conditions. And and let's listen to all 3 of them, because you stated it very clearly. Let's listen.
3 issues for that. The corruption in the country, whether or not other countries were participating in the support of the Ukraine, and whether or not they were cooperating in an ongoing investigation with our Department of Justice. That's completely legitimate.
Not only did you say that investigating the Democrats was one of the 3 conditions, not 2, that you had just said that you had talked about. Investigating the Democrats was part of the quid pro quo. You also said if I may. It was part of the Justice Department investigation into the origins of the Russia probe. But the fact is, not only did the press think you said it, here's what a statement that was put out by a senior Justice Department official. If the White House was withholding aid in regards to the cooperation of any investigation of the Department of Justice, that is news to us. Everybody thinks that that's what you said, and you didn't. You said right there, 3 points, not 2.
Well, and a couple of different things. You, again, said just a few seconds ago that I said there was a quid pro quo. Never use that language, because there is not a quid pro quo.
You were asked by Jonathan Karl, you described a quid pro quo, and you said that happens all the time.
And reporters will use their language all the time. So my language never said quid pro quo. But let's get to the heart of the matter. Go back and look at that list of 3 things. What was I talking about? Things that it was legitimate for the president to do. Number 1, it is legitimate for the president to want to know what's going on with the ongoing investigation into the server. Everybody acknowledges that. At least I think most normal people do. It's completely legitimate to ask about that. Number 2, it's legitimate to tie the aid to corruption. It's legitimate to tie the aid to foreign aid from other countries. That's what I was talking about with a 3. Can I see how people took that the wrong way? Absolutely. But I never said there was a quid pro quo, because there isn't. Again, Chris, you've been in these briefings. You know how back and forth it is. You know how rapid fire it is. Look to the facts on the ground, things that you can actually sort of certify. And what should put this issue to bed is that the money flowed without any connection whatsoever to the DNC server.
You, in your first answer, which I gave, you said that's why we held up the money. First, you just said here that it was for 2 reasons. Now you're acknowledging it was for 3 reasons. If you held up the money for 3 reasons, that's a quid pro quo. You got to satisfy us on those. Now, maybe the president backed off that, but that was the proposition here.
No, I'm not acknowledging there's 3 reasons. Again, let's go back.
You said 3 reasons.
Go back to I recognize that. Go back to what actually happened in the real world. And by the way, go to the phone call. Go to the phone call which we've released. I hope we get a chance to talk about that before the interview is over.
I am going to right now.
You go to the phone call. The president never mentions the aid at all in the phone call. Doesn't say, oh, by the way, I need you to do this, 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 and this, or else the money won't flow. We all know enough about this president that if he feels very strongly about something, he's going to put that out there directly, and that didn't happen. So I recognize that folks, that I didn't speak clearly. Maybe on Thursday folks misinterpreted what I said, but the facts are absolutely clear, and they are there for everyone to see.
And actually, the interview goes on. You can go to the link in the video description to the entire Fox News Sunday program. Hopefully it's available to you. At least if it's not available right now, it will eventually become available. And you can see the whole interview where you'll see Chris Wallace then goes on to talk about the transcript of the phone call that was released by the so-called transcript. It's a summary transcript of the phone call where Trump brings up the Bidens and said, you know, I want you to do me a favor, though, and all that. And then at the end of the interview, in a clip I almost took that was almost the political comedy clip of the week, where Chris Wallace asked about Trump's decision to hold the G7 conference at his Doral resort in Miami and then deciding not to do it. And you'll see Mick Mulvaney say, well, you know, he still considers himself to be in the hospitality industry, which contradicts everything Trump said at the beginning of his presidency, that he was going to cut himself off totally from his business, give it over to his children, like that Donald Jr. and Eric, who aren't in the Trump administration. They're taking care of that. They're not making any foreign deals. And, of course, none of that's true. And there's all sorts of foreign money coming into the Trump business and to the Trump children, and even Ivanka Trump, the trademarks in China that she got, and Jared Kushner, her husband, Trump's son-in-law, all of his weird business dealings. That's I don't even want to go into all of that. And so the whole admission at the end that Trump still considers himself to be in the hospitality industry, and that's why he wanted to bring everyone to his Doral resort, that was something that I should have taken that clip, but that was over 6 minutes of Chris Wallace doing a good job cross-examining Mick Mulvaney. Is he still the chief of staff, the acting chief of staff? I don't know if he's going to last the week with that performance and his performance at that press conference. I guess that's why there aren't any press conferences in the White House press room anymore, because nobody can really defend what is actually coming out about what the Trump administration is doing. And in that vein, I want to show you the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, who showed up on ABC News' This Week with George Stephanopoulos. He talked a lot about Syria and what was going on there, and there's a lot of bogusness to look into there that I'm not going to do because I don't really feel that I have the background to really... I've tried as best I can to delineate what's going on with the Syrian Kurds, and I talked a little bit last week about Wilson's 14 points promising self-determination to the Kurds like 100 years ago, and how George H.W. Bush abandoned the Kurds at the end of the first Gulf War, and but beyond that, it's not one of my areas of expertise, and I really want to cover the impeachment. And one of the things that Mike Pompeo couldn't answer about was this. I mean, I've been thinking of making this video comparing Secretary of State Mike Pompeo to Sergeant Schultz on Hogan's Heroes. I don't know if anyone watched Hogan's Heroes years ago, but he has a passing, he doesn't have the mustache, but he does have a passing resemblance to the actor. I believe his name was John Banner, not Banner. I think it's John Banner, played Sergeant Schultz. You can correct me in the comment section if I got that wrong. But he had like this catchphrase in the series, if you watch it, I know nothing, I see nothing. And the resemblance and the catchphrase, I've been thinking of making a Mike Pompeo Sergeant Schultz video because he says basically that he knows nothing about the quid pro quo. And that's hypothetical, even though the chief of staff kind of admitted to the quid pro quo, and not to mention the whole summary transcript of the phone call with the president of the Ukraine shows Trump asking for a favor, though. The Ukrainian president mentions wanting to buy the anti-tank missiles, and Trump says, I want you to do us a favor, though. And he talks about investigating the conspiracy theory that the Democrats actually worked with the Ukrainians to make it look like their server. The server was actually hacked by Ukrainians, the whole Crowdstrike conspiracy theory, and then, of course, investigating the Bidens and all of that. But Mike Pompeo saw nothing, he knows nothing, and there's this very awkward silence about 30 seconds before the end of this 3.5-minute clip where George Stephanopoulos does a good job of cross-examining Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, about how he's implicated in this whole Ukrainian impeachment scandal that he saw and knows nothing about over here.
To achieve.
Let me move on now to the situation in Ukraine and that press conference by Mick Mulvaney, the acting chief of staff, on Thursday, where he said that decision to withhold military aid, that it was in part conditioned on this on the Ukraine pursuing a political investigation for President Trump. Here's what he said.
Did he also mention to me in the past the corruption related to the DNC server? Absolutely. No question about that. But that's it. And that's why we held up the money. Now, there was a report.
So the demand for an investigation into the Democrats was part of the reason that he ordered to withhold funding to Ukraine.
The look back to what happened in 2016
investigation of Democrats
was part of the thing that he was worried about in corruption with that nation. And that is absolutely
withholding the funding.
Yeah, which ultimately then flowed.
Pretty startling admission right there, drawing some criticism from Democrats, certainly, but also some Republicans in the Senate, including Lisa Murkowski, Senator Lisa Murkowski from Alaska, who said this, quote, "You don't hold up foreign aid that we had previously appropriated for a political initiative, period." Is Senator Murkowski correct?
George, I never saw that in the decision-making process that I was a part of. The decisions surrounding whether there should be Department of Defense assistance as well as some State Department assistance provided to push back against Russia. The conversation was always around what were the strategic implications? Would that money get to the right place, or would there be corruption in Ukraine and the money wouldn't flow to the mission that it was intended for? How do we protect that? Is it appropriate for us to provide defensive weapon systems? George, you'll remember, I don't know why Barack Obama held up that funding. Maybe he had a theory too. I don't know. He never provided it. This administration's done it not once, not twice, but now three times.
President Trump,
the people in Ukraine are safer and more secure as a result of that, and the Russians certainly don't appreciate
But President Trump ordered Mick Mulvaney to suspend the aid, and you saw Mr. Mulvaney right there say that one of the reasons was indeed this idea that the Ukrainians had to pursue these political investigations.
I'll leave to the chief of staff to explain what it is he said and what he intended. I can speak clearly to what America's strategic objectives were in providing this defensive weaponry to the people of Ukraine.
So do you agree then with Senator Murkowski that it would have been inappropriate to withhold the military aid unless this political investigation was pursued?
George, I'm telling you what I was involved with. I'm telling you what I saw transpiring and how President Trump was working to make the evaluation about whether it was appropriate to provide this assistance.
But that's what I'm asking is, would it be appropriate to condition that?
Yeah, George, I'm not going to get into hypotheticals and secondary things based on what someone else has said. George, you would have never done it when you were the spokesman. I'm not going to do it here today.
Except it's not a hypothetical. We saw the chief of staff, the acting chief of staff.
It is, George. You just said George, you just said if this happened. That is by definition a hypothetical.
The chief of staff said it did.
George, you asked me if this happened. It's a hypothetical. I've told you what I observed, what I saw the process related to this very funding. What we did and how we thought about that was aimed at the strategic interests of the United States of America in the right and appropriate way to ensure that there wasn't corruption in Ukraine that would divert these resources to an inappropriate place.
The evidence and testimony being collected by Congress is also establishing that the president's meeting.
So like I said, about 30 seconds before the end of that clip, George Stephanopoulos is like, well, the chief of staff said that this quid pro quo happened. And there's this long silence, and Mick Mulvaney, who, if you give him a mustache, put on one of those German helmets, I think John Banner, I saw everyone was saying it was John Banner. That's, I think, first I said John Bannon, but then I was more certain John Banner, the actor who played Sergeant Schultz. I think there is a resemblance between Mick Mulvaney, and not Mick Mulvaney, between Mike Pompeo and John Banner, who played Sergeant Schultz. And he, after his long pause, he said, I saw nothing. I know nothing about quid pro quo. I know nothing about the Ukrainian military aid being contingent upon investigating conspiracy theories about the DNC server actually being hacked by Ukrainians, and of course the whole investigation of Burisma. That's what Sunderland, the guy who gave $1 million to the Trump inaugural committee, he's a hotelier from Portland with no foreign policy experience, who became the ambassador to the EU, and the EU does not include Ukraine, but somehow he was in charge of this whole Ukraine thing, and he had the back and forth text with Bill Taylor. Well, you saw all that in the news summaries before, but something stinks pretty bad, and even if our Sergeant Schultz, Mike Pompeo, Secretary of State, saw nothing and knows nothing, he should have smelled something, I think. But I thought that was a pretty disingenuous answer from the Secretary of State. You can let me know what you think down in the comment section. And now I'm going to show two more Republicans becoming more and more concerned about what's going on. These are two Republican members of the House of Representatives who are leaving at the end of their term, so you would think they would be a little bit free to question some of these wrongdoings that are pretty obvious. And here is Margaret Brennan asking as softly as possible, well, even if there's not a quid pro quo, what about the perception or the understanding? And Will Hurd is still hanging on to the lack of evidence of people in the Ukraine saying that they felt the pressure, which isn't even really necessary for an impeachable offense, but that's what Will Hurd is talking about with Margaret Brennan, I guess, in the 90-second clip I'll talk about with you after we watch it together over here.
Interviews are super important.
Do you think that there was if not a quid pro quo, an understanding or a perception of one between the White House and Ukraine?
That's a good question, and to me, that's the heart of this matter. And what was the, if there was a quid pro quo, what was it for? Was it for investigation of the previous election, or was it to get dirt for 2020? And what we haven't heard yet, we haven't heard from any Ukrainian official that felt like there was this arrangement. We haven't even had a Ukrainian official tell a State Department official that they felt like their arms were being twisted. I would have thought, based on some of the State Department officials that we've met, we've interviewed so far, that you would even get an inkling of that was happening. When I was in the CIA, I participated in diplomacy as well, and this is very often that the country you're posted to, in this case, let's say Ukraine, if they hear something, they're going to go to their contacts at the embassy and say, hey, what does this actually mean? And we haven't gotten any whiff of that when it comes to this issue. I also want to know, who did Rudy Giuliani actually talk to?
Mm-hmm.
We know for a fact he's talked to 2 Ukrainians, the former
So you'd
AG.
like him to come before the committee and answer questions?
Oh, for sure.
From
I
Republicans
think having Mayor Giuliani come and testify is important.
I want to get to Syria because I know you.
So, like I said, that was one Republican who he seems a little suspicious, but he still isn't. He hasn't gotten a whiff of any State Department official saying that they heard from the Ukrainians that they felt the pressure. Of course, that's for bribery and extortion. That's for the quid pro quo thing, for just the solicitation of a foreigner to give you something of value in a federal election that I talked about at the beginning. You don't need that quid pro quo, but that's what Will Hurd is talking about. But there's one more Republican. This is Francis Rooney. For the last couple videos, LiberalViewer Sunday live clip roundups, I've been talking about Ferris Bueller Day Off references, because a couple weeks ago Matthew Broderick was actually the guest host, showed up showed up on Saturday Night Live playing, was it Mike Pompeo? Did he play Mike Pompeo? Maybe it was Mike Pompeo. And then there was this weird Ferris Bueller's Day Off reference in a previous week, but this week the Ferris Bueller's Day Off reference, hold on, let me look at my notes here, is this. I was thinking maybe the principal in Ferris Bueller's Day Off was Mr. Rooney. I thought he was Francis Rooney, but he's actually Ed Rooney. But I thought, because this is the one Republican now retiring who is thinking he might support impeachment, it's not Ed Rooney. It's not a Ferris Bueller's Day Off reference. Sorry. But this is Francis Rooney talking to Jake Tapper. The weird thing about State of the Union this week is usually there's here in California, there's a 6 a.m. show and a 9 a.m. show. And the 9 a.m. show is a repeat of the 6 a.m. show. But this week they showed a brief clip of Francis Rooney in the 6 a.m. show and a longer interview of Amy Klobuchar. But actually, in the 9 a.m. show, they didn't show Amy Klobuchar, they showed Francis Rooney, and that's where I took this final Republican clip. This is the one Republican who's leaving Congress who may support impeachment, that I'll talk about with you a little more after we watch that CNN State of the Union clip from the second show, not the first show, over here.
Back to State of the Union, I'm Jake Tapper, the very first House Republican to say he would consider voting to impeach President Trump. Consider is now saying he will not seek re-election next year. Congressman Francis Rooney announced his retirement just a day after telling CNN that he could not rule out whether President Trump had committed an impeachable offense. Joining me now, Republican Congressman Francis Rooney of Florida. He's a member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. Thanks so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me on, Jake.
So you've called the Ukraine scandal very, very serious and troubling. You say you're not ruling out the possibility of an impeachable offense. If Speaker Pelosi were to call a vote tomorrow for launching an impeachment inquiry, not impeachment itself, but just an inquiry to find out what the facts are, how do you think you'd vote?
I'm not 100% sure right this second. I want to hear what Ambassador Taylor has to say Tuesday, and I'm hoping to have a chance to hear Ambassador Bolton before any of that would happen, because what I've heard so far is quite troubling. It's quite troubling that we had a rump diplomatic outreach of civilians derogating our paid public servant diplomats.
I want you to take a listen to the acting White House Chief of Staff, Mick Mulvaney, essentially admitting a quid pro quo.
Did he also mention to me in the past the corruption related to the DNC server? Absolutely. No question about that. But that's it. And that's why we held up the money.
To be clear, what you just described is a quid pro quo. It is funding will not flow unless the investigation into the Democratic server happened as well.
We do that all the time with foreign policy.
So we all heard it. It goes on, and it's all clearly quid pro quo. He then issued a statement trying to say that he didn't say what we all heard him say. You didn't buy it.
I don't see how you walk back something that's clear. I would say game, set, match on that.
And is that impeachable? I mean,
game, set, match on that. Well, that was Representative Francis Rooney of Florida. I thought he might be from Nevada. There was some Republican member of Congress from Nevada who seemed like he might be supporting impeachment, and then he wavered and said no, he wasn't. And there's been Mitt Romney, there's been Justin Amash, who is no longer a Republican, but whether that's going to turn into a greater set of Republicans who are going to oppose the lawlessness, the abuse of power, the unconstitutional obstruction of justice, obstruction of Congress, abuse of the emoluments. I mean, the impeachable offenses go on, but there's, of course, the violation of this 52 U.S. Code 30121, contributions and donations by foreign nationals. Donald Trump is also individual one in the campaign finance violations, for which Michael Cohen is now in prison. There's the whole Roger Stone trial that's coming up next month that is going to show how there actually was collusion between the Trump campaign and the Russians, in that they coordinated with WikiLeaks, who published the hacked Russian emails. And because they're the publishers, that's not a crime, but it's still collusion. And just like there really is collusion, there's also a quid pro quo, even though you don't need collusion for there to be an impeachable offense from the Mueller report, and you don't need a quid pro quo for there to be an impeachable offense from the whole Ukraine scandal. But anyway, I think I explained that pretty clearly over and over again in my first topic, the Trump quid pro quo, and why not all quid pro quos are bad and not all bad things require a quid pro quo. And you can click back to the beginning of that topic if you want to understand how I explained that again. But now I want to get to my last 3 news clips before I get to the Dash and Sandy clips for the Dash and Sandy fans out there. But these are the news clips on the Democratic candidate, 2020 Democratic presidential candidates. I unfortunately couldn't do a debate clip roundup for for various reasons that I talked briefly about earlier. I wasn't able to cover the debate, but my very brief coverage of what happened is, first I would say Elizabeth Warren has become almost the front runner, if not the front runner. Everyone seemed to be attacking her, and I think she did a good job. I've said, I voted for Bernie Sanders in the primaries in 2016, and in the next election. So far, I'm leaning towards Elizabeth Warren, and I think she did well in the last debate. Joe Biden seems to be kind of deflating, and there are a couple of the lower level candidates who are rising to try to take the mantle of the alternative moderate if Biden falters, as it looks like he may be faltering. And the two who did the best at that are Pete Buttigieg and Amy Klobuchar. And I'm going to show two Pete Buttigieg clips and one Amy Klobuchar clip. And they're actually talking about healthcare, where they took on Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders on their Medicare for All plan. Bernie Sanders, I think, he just had to show up at the debate and show he was a viable candidate, literally, because he just came back from a heart attack, and he accomplished that goal. And then this week he got endorsed by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Michael Moore in a big rally in, I think it was in Brooklyn, that got a huge, like 30,000 attendees, something like that. And so he is definitely still showing his strength. And so, like I think that is sort of my summary of what happened in the debate on Tuesday, with Biden kind of deflating, Elizabeth Warren rising, Bernie Sanders showing his viability, and then Pete Buttigieg and Amy Klobuchar sort of positioning themselves as the alternative moderates to Biden. And they did that sort of by attacking Medicare for all. And I thought Elizabeth Warren actually did a good job attacking back Pete Buttigieg, saying his Medicare for all who want it is really Medicare for all who can afford it. The public option in the Pete Buttigieg plan, and even more so in the Amy Klobuchar plan, is something where you have to buy in and be able to afford it, and so fewer people are covered. But I'll talk about all of that a little more after I show first two Pete Buttigieg clips, then an Amy Klobuchar clip, and then I'm actually going to have multiple Dash and Sandy clips at the end for the Dash and Sandy fans. But first, here's NBC News' Meet the Press. Chuck Todd doing an introduction where he shows how Pete Buttigieg had some conflicts with Elizabeth Warren and Tulsi Gabbard. And there's the whole Tulsi Gabbard is a Russian agent accusation from Hillary Clinton that comes up in the end of this clip from Chuck Todd talking to Pete Buttigieg on Meet the Press. And I'll talk about all of that a little more after we watch that 3.5-minute clip together over here.
Welcome back. Pete Buttigieg burst onto the Democratic primary scene with a gusher of good press and campaign contributions. But after that impressive start, he did fall back into the second tier of candidates, well behind Joe Biden, Elizabeth Warren, and Bernie Sanders. But at Tuesday's debate, the South Bend mayor tried to regain the initiative with a more aggressive approach.
Well, we heard it tonight, a yes or no question that didn't get a yes or no answer. Your signature, Senator, is to have a plan for everything, except this. I don't need lessons from you on courage, political or personal. You can put an end to endless war without embracing Donald Trump's policy.
Will you end the regime change war is the question.
And Mayor Pete Buttigieg joins me now. Welcome back to Meet the Press.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Let me move to the debate and the back and forth in particular you had with Senator Warren. You were pretty tough on her and her inability to tell you how she's going to pay for her Medicare for All plan. You've been pretty evasive on how you're paying for yours. You've said it's going to be some cost savings plus corporate tax reform. But you haven't said much after that. What are some details on how you're paying for your Medicare for all who want it?
Sure. So we score it out as $1.5 trillion over that period of time. The vast majority of that can be recovered by rolling back the corporate tax rate cut portion of the Trump tax cuts.
So it'll go from what to what?
That'll take care of the $1.4 trillion if we just revert to the pre-Trump level.
So you want to just basically roll back the entire corporate tax cut?
And
is that going to be easy? That's easier said than done.
Well, governing is easier said than done. But we have a responsibility to make sure that dollars that have gone to line the pockets of people who didn't even need it are instead going to make sure that the American people can get health care. Now, just to give you a full mathematical answer, that's almost enough to deliver what I say that we need, but there's a little bit more that we're going to recover through the savings to the government from my prescription drug plan, because when we allow the government to negotiate drug prices, that actually leads to a return to the Treasury. So the bigger point here is my plan is paid for, and we have an opportunity to get everybody health care without kicking people off their private plans and without the multi-trillion-dollar hole that appears to be there unexplained in Senator Warren's plan.
Before I let you go, I was curious if you had any reaction to former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton implying that Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard might be a Russian asset.
What I'll say is that I'm not going to get into their dispute. What I will say is that we know right now.
Is that appropriate?
Well, I suppose when you become a private citizen, you can say whatever you want.
I understand that, but she's a sitting member of Congress. She served.
Well, I certainly honor her service. As we saw in the debate, I also have strong disagreements with her on topics like Syria. But the bigger issue here is Russia is working to interfere with our elections right now. And we know a big part of how they're going to do it is exploiting divisions among the American people with their information operations. We've got to become a harder target, and as president, I will make sure, using all of our tools, diplomatic, economic, and security, that there is enough deterrence that Russia would, or any country, would never again calculate that it is in their interest to mess with our democracy.
I just wonder if you're comfortable, I mean, throw a charge out there making her deny it. That's a Trumpian move.
Well, we got to focus on the task at hand right now, and that includes making sure that this presidency comes to an end. That is my focus. That and what happens after this presidency comes to an end.
So you're comfortable with Hillary Clinton's critique of Tulsi Gabbard and how she went about it?
No, I'm not. Okay. I'm also not going to get in the middle of it because.
So yeah, that was basically Pete Buttigieg's answer when he was asked both on Meet the Press and CNN's State of the Union about the Tulsi Gabbard Russian asset accusation from Hillary Clinton. And I've talked about this a couple times over the last several months when I've talked about Tulsi Gabbard, that there are these rumors, and I haven't, I think she hired this guy Chris Cooper. I saw Bill Broward is his name, Bill Broward, the guy who was responsible for the Magnitsky Act, said that Tulsi Gabbard may not be a Russian asset, but she covered the agent for the Russians, Chris Cooper, I think his name is Chris Cooper, as one of her consultants, even though he was working for the Russians to oppose the Magnitsky Act. And so that's the only evidence I've seen that she is in some way, I mean, hiring someone who was a spokesman for the Russians as one of your consultants, I mean, that seems like hiring a lawyer who worked for someone else. I don't know, that's sort of guilt by association, but I don't know if there's more to it than that. And then she has refused to say negative things about Assad, and has said some positive things about Assad in Syria. And Assad is kind of a Russian asset, but beyond that, I don't know what is true and why Hillary Clinton said what she said. That, and about Jill Stein being a Russian asset, I know there's like photos of Jill Stein and Michael Flynn, the national security advisor for Trump, who had to resign and plead guilty to lying about what he said about Russians. That I think he was sitting at a table with Jill Stein, or they were at like the same like Russian dinner or something. But that, of course, is not the same thing as being a Russian asset. You can let me know what you think about all that down in the comment section. But the thing I really wanted to focus on was the healthcare plans. Like I said before, I showed that Pete Buttigieg clip. I thought Elizabeth Warren did a good job of countering what Pete Buttigieg said about Elizabeth Warren paying for her plan, where she won't say she's going to raise taxes on the middle class because she wants to focus on how their costs are going to go down, because any taxes that go up will be less than what they no longer pay in premiums and co-pays and other healthcare expenses. And I think that is a reasonable position for a Democrat to take, because it's really costs, not taxes, that are important. If I pay, $1,000 more per year in taxes, but pay $3,000 a year less in premiums and co-pays, etc., I'm $2,000 ahead when it comes to costs, and I shouldn't be, nailed by these Republican talking points about raising taxes on the middle class when the middle class is actually going to pay less. And that's the thing about single payer, is that all the industrialized countries who have a single payer system pay less than we do. And so there is an inherent lower cost in the Medicare for All plan. And no one really cross-examined Pete Buttigieg on his Medicare for all who want it, leaving people uncovered. But I think Jake Tapper, at least on CNN's State of the Union, did a better job of cross-examining Pete Buttigieg on how he used to be for Medicare for all and isn't anymore, in a clip that I will talk about with you a little more after we watch it together over here.
I want to turn to the Democratic race, if I can. You attacked your 2020 opponent, Elizabeth Warren, the senator from Massachusetts, on stage over how she's going to pay for Medicare for all. A Warren campaign aide subsequently told CNN, quote, she's reviewing the revenue options suggested by the 2016 Bernie campaign along with other revenue options, but she will only support pay-fors that meet the principles she has laid out in multiple debates. Is that answer good enough for you?
No, we need to see how this is going to be paid for, because right now, whether you copy-paste the Bernie Sanders math or do it some other way, there is a hole amounting to trillions of dollars in how this is supposed to work. And the really unfortunate thing is, we can deliver health care to every American without that problem, and without the problem that I think is the central problem in her plan of kicking everybody off of their private plans in 4 years or less. That's why the approach that I'm offering, Medicare for all who want it, is a better approach. It's better because it gives you the choice to decide whether you want in on the public Medicare option or you want to stay on your private plan. And it's better because it's actually paid for.
So the attack is kind of confusing because, as you know, in 2018, you were asked whether you supported Medicare for all and whether insurance does not belong in healthcare. And you tweeted back in part, quote, I, Pete Buttigieg, politician, do henceforth and forthwith declare most affirmatively and indubitably unto the ages that I do favor Medicare for all, as I do favor any measure that would help get all Americans covered. So what happened to that 2018 Medicare for all pledge?
Well, the substance is the same. Obviously, my tone there reflected that.
You're being a little cheeky, but you are supporting Medicare for all, and you no longer are.
I think Medicare for all means everybody can get into Medicare. And somewhere along the line this year, politicians started saying that it's only Medicare for all if you eliminate all private coverage, which is why I now talk about my plan with the language of Medicare for all who want it. But I think the issue here really isn't terminology. The issue is, what is it that we're going to deliver, and does it give everybody access to Medicare and choice? My plan does both of those things. It's what most Americans want. It's what most Democrats want. It's the best policy. And I'm not having these problems describing how it's going to be paid for.
So you've also been accusing Senator Warren of not being straight with the people because she won't acknowledge that middle-class taxes will go up, while at the same time we should point out, obviously, there would be no insurance premiums and no out-of-pocket expenses under this. And so her argument is costs will go down, but she doesn't use the word taxes going up. Take a listen to this exchange that you and I had during the second Democratic debate. You are willing to raise taxes on middle-class Americans in order to have universal coverage with the disappearance of insurance premiums, yes or no?
I think you can buy into it. That's the idea of Medicare for all who want it. Look, this is a distinction without a difference, whether you're paying the same money in the form of taxes or premiums.
This is a distinction without a difference, whether you're paying the same money in the form of taxes or premiums. Isn't that the same argument that Elizabeth Warren is making?
Well, first of all, I'm willing to say it out loud. And secondly, the problem isn't just how she talks about it. The problem is the multi-trillion-dollar hole. In other words, even if you accept what she's saying, taxes go up, premiums go down, you come out ahead, fine. There's still a multi-trillion-dollar hole in this plan. That's the problem, added to the fact that if you like your private plan, her vision will kick you off of it in 4 years or less. And we don't have to do this. Look, what I'm proposing amounts to the boldest health care reform
in more than 50 years. This is the biggest thing we will have done to American healthcare since Medicare itself was invented, and it has the advantage of preserving Americans' freedom to choose.
Well, if it happened, it would be bold, but it wouldn't be bolder than Medicare for All, because Medicare for All obviously would rejigger the entire healthcare system.
And that's just the point. Here we are offering things that are the boldest action on a given issue area, like healthcare, in my lifetime, only to have some folks say, that's not good enough unless you go even further. And these purity tests, I think, run the risk of derailing us from a historic opportunity to gather an American majority around historic reforms. We can do this. We should do this. And by the way, it's the best policy. Because if Medicare for All, if a single-payer environment is the right destination, which I think it very well may be, then the best way to get there is to give everybody the choice. If the public plan is the best one, everybody will eventually choose it. And if it's not, then we're going to be really glad we didn't force people onto it.
We're running out of time, so I do want to flip to a different topic, which is the last Democratic presidential nominee, Hillary Clinton, appeared to suggest that one of your fellow campaign nominees.
And Jake Tapper then asks about the whole Tulsi Gabbard controversy with Hillary Clinton, and he answers the same, but I think you saw Jake Tapper did a significantly better job than Chuck Todd on cross-examining Pete Buttigieg about his plan, although for some reason neither one of them asked what Elizabeth Warren asked in the actual debate, which is, what about all the people that Medicare for All who want it don't get covered? Because the one great thing about Medicare for All is that it covers everyone, and that's because of way back in 2016, Bernie Sanders put together the Medicare for All bill, and page 8 of it, as Amy Klobuchar points out in the next clip, says no more private insurance because in 4 years we're going to cover everyone with Medicare, and that's how we get universal coverage. That's how everyone gets covered. And Pete Buttigieg knew that. You saw Jake Tapper cross-examine him in that last clip with a tweet. It was from February 2018, which is years after the Medicare for All bill came out that Bernie Sanders put out, and Elizabeth Warren also supports, that says on page 8, as Amy Klobuchar is about to say, no private insurance. So in some ways, Amy Klobuchar did the best job of cross-examining Pete Buttigieg, better than Jake Tapper and Chuck Todd, in the final news clip that I will talk about with you a little more from CNN's State of the Union, where Amy Klobuchar gives her rationale for being the moderate alternative if Joe Biden falters over here.
So let me ask you, you joined Mayor Pete Buttigieg, who I just talked to, in criticizing Senator Warren on the debate stage for, in your view, in his view, not being fully honest about how she intends to pay for Medicare for All. Senator Warren's campaign has since said that she's, quote, reviewing the revenue options suggested by the 2016 Bernie campaign along with other revenue options, unquote. Is that good enough for you?
No, it's not. I've made very clear how I'm going to pay for everything that I've put out there. I think that's important because we've got a president that's added trillions of dollars to the debt on the shoulders of our kids, and I think we need to make the case. And as I said at the debate stage, I just think I have a better way, a way that will insure more people and bring premiums down, and that's with the non-profit public option. And it doesn't trash Obamacare. It builds on Obamacare. And I think you have to show how you're going to pay for things. And that was the point. And I don't think any one person on that stage has a monopoly on good ideas. And that seems to be what she's said through these debates. And I thought it was really important to make that point for the people of the country and our primary voters. There's another way. And one other thing I wanted to add as I was listening to your interview with the mayor is that that bill has been very clear from the beginning. On page 8, it says that it will dismantle our current insurance system. It says that 149 million people will be kicked off their current insurance. That's what it says. And Senator Sanders has been very honest about that. But I think we have to be honest about that. All the people in the Senate that was on that stage and others who said they supported it, they signed on to that. I got a lot of pressure to sign on to it. I read it and I decided there was a better way and a different way to do it. So I just look people in there.
You're suggesting that Mayor Pete Buttigieg, having endorsed Medicare for All in that tweet that I referred to in 2018, is not being honest today? Is that what you're suggesting?
What I'm saying is people need to look at these bills and understand what they're looking at. And I don't know if he ever looked at the bill, but the bill has always said that. And that's the bill that's been the one that Senator Sanders has led in the U.S. Senate. And like I said, I think there's a better way. I made the decision, and that happens all the time. You get pressure from a lot of people to do things in Washington. And this president, President Trump, has been folding to all kinds of pressure. He gets a call from Erdogan, and what does he do? He puts the Kurds out to slaughter. He gets a call from Vladimir Putin, and what does he do? He says that he doesn't believe that Russia invaded our election. He gets a call from, like someone does, from the pharmaceutical companies, and he doesn't do anything to take on pharma. I think we need a president that stands up to that kind of pressure, that does what they think is right. It doesn't mean that everyone agrees with you, but that's what I do. That's what I've done throughout my time in Washington. And I think that the American people are looking for that kind of grit.
All right, Senator Amy Klobuchar from the great state of Minnesota, thanks so much for joining us from Iowa.
And I guess Amy Klobuchar has grit. She likes to say grit. That's one of her catchphrases. She has grit, and that makes her the moderate alternative to Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders if Joe Biden falters. And I think I pretty much pre-criticized that clip, but I think, like I pointed out before I showed the clip, Amy Klobuchar did the best job of criticizing Pete Buttigieg's criticism of Elizabeth Warren, but I think Elizabeth Warren still is continuing to rise. Joe Biden is continuing to deflate, and like I said, Bernie Sanders showed his viability, especially with these endorsements this week, and I don't know where all that's going to go, but I appreciate all of you who showed up for my Sunday live clip roundup, especially those of you who gave me super chat contributions along the way. I saw these so far. So yeah, for the last several weeks, my video has been demonetized for almost all the time it's gotten views. So that's why I appreciate the super chat contributions, because I've gotten very little ad revenue. Sexy Bob, by the way, was I in a laundry room? Well, there actually was a washer dryer near where I was broadcasting, but actually I was in this rental housing in Northern California, in the forests by the ocean, and there was this big main room. It was a 2-story place, and I was in a hallway between 2 rooms in this big main vestibule. So it wasn't really a laundry room. It was really like this huge main vestibule from which the bedrooms and everything else connected, and it was 2 stories tall, so there were a lot of echoes, and I apologize again for the echoes last week, but I'm back in my broadcast studio this week, and I appreciate those super chat contributions. And before I finish, I am back with Dash and Sandy this week, and I recorded a Dash and Sandy clip this morning. First, I want to show you during that Francis Rooney clip. This is Dash and Sandy. I thought this was all I was going to get for you this morning over here.
Come in.
Will not seek re-election next year. Congressman Francis Rooney announced his retirement just today after telling CNN that he could not rule out whether President Trump had committed an impeachable offense. Republican Congressman Francis Rooney of Florida is a member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. So you called the Ukraine scandal.
But actually, during the show, and in fact, right now I have. Dash is over here, or Sandy is to the left of me, Dash is to the right of me, and here I am for the Steve Miller Band. Is that the Steve Miller Band who does that song? Joker's to the left of me, clowns to the right, here I am. Is that the lyric? But anyway, so I actually, during the show, I got the Sandy to the left of me and Dash to the right of me clip. Here's Sandy to the left of me. And Dash to the right of me, here I am. I don't know what happened with that Sandy clip. It was like, I don't know what happened there. But anyway, I hope that was okay, and I hope you enjoyed the clips I picked out. If you like what I'm doing, you can support me financially on Patreon and on PayPal at links I put down in the video description. Otherwise, you can just give me a supportive comment, a thumbs up, subscribe to my channel, and I will see you next week and every Sunday for the foreseeable future, covering the impeachment. And until next week, I guess I will be seeing all of you around the internet.